welcome to today's show, where my guest is Kelly James Clark, a person whose work I first came across actually when I was an evangelical Christian in the book Four Views. I think it's Four Views on. I don't know if it was Four Views on Apologetics or Four Views
on Apologetics. Yeah,
right. And I remember actually your essays in there. Sort of like sparring with William Lane Craig, I found very, very good at the time. And today we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of topics relating to, epistemology, religious faith, belief, pluralism, those sorts of things, and politics finally. So is there anything that you think the audience should know about your background before we begin?
Well, as you know, and maybe your audience knows, I'm a philosopher by trade, but I do work that impinges on theology. And I also think that a lot of philosophers aren't very public facing. And I've tried to do a lot of work that communicates broadly to the public. I try to do scholarship and publish scholarly works as well. But I also think we have obligations to other kinds of communities, including the sort of general community, the general Christian community, and even the world at large. I write sometimes with keeping my Muslim brothers and sisters in mind, for example, when I write, or my Jewish brothers and sisters in mind when I write, and not mostly professors, but just people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I think philosophy and academia generally can be very inaccessible. So, I'm also always grateful kind of doing this when people who have expertise are willing to come on and talk and be interviewed and things. So yeah, I appreciate those efforts too. My first question then for you is on the topic of natural theology and reason. So, how do you think about reason, and how does that relate to your thinking about natural theology? Do you think that the correct approach to God or religion is to think about these things through sort of like logical proofs, or is there a different role for those things? Is there no role at all? How do these things fit together in your mind?
Yeah. Well, lots of questions in that. I suppose I'm broadly Augustinian in the faith-seeking understanding sort of way. I think we have all sorts of beliefs, and they're ones that aren't typically we have all sorts of beliefs that aren't based on logical reasoning. Most of our beliefs, most of the time, are ones that are produced directly by our cognitive faculties in a certain environment, usually in response to some kind of prompting. Like I might say to anyone who's listening, what color is, or what pattern is Nathan's shirt, and they won't have noticed before, but now they'll immediately believe it's plaid on maybe bluish green. And what does he have on his nose? They might think glasses, even though they were always seeing it, but had no beliefs about it. So I think by and large, our beliefs are produced immediately by our cognitive faculties in various environments, and usually in response to various promptings. And those are just perceptual beliefs. I think belief in God for most of us is the same way. I think for most of us, most of the time, most of us believe in God probably because our parents taught us, and the beliefs that we have are ones that we have mostly because of our parental communities, but also because of our wider communities. But I remember asking a class one time, it was during a presidential election, how many of you vote the same way as your parents? I said, I don't care what you vote, just like, do you vote the same way as your parents? And 95% or more, maybe all the hands went up. They all voted the same way as their parents. 18 to 22-year-old, that time period is a good time to re-examine beliefs and reasoning, or looking at arguments and looking at evidence. I think is a good time. There's a good time at age 18 if you have the leisure. If you have the leisure to be a college student and a leisure to take the time to think about things, that's the time to start, I think, really examining and maybe looking at some of the evidence that you might have for or against your belief. So I think I think by and large, arguments play a role later on in belief. By and large, I think beliefs happen to us in various ways that are produced in us immediately. I think those beliefs are rational. So I think reason includes the kind of promptings of our dispositions in certain environments. But reasoning is something that can happen later, and it can happen in two ways. One is it can undermine beliefs that we already have. Maybe, most people don't have really deep die on the cross for Jesus sort of faith when they're 18 years old. So there could be something like the death of a parent or a brother or a sister or something, and you just can't see how to fit that in to your all things work together for good for those who love God. Or maybe you go to college and learn about all the innocent people that died in China in the Cultural Revolution, 80 million people. And maybe it really bothers you. You think, why would God let people die? You'd heard about the Holocaust probably when you were young, and it's easier to fit in when you're younger and not thinking too hard about it. But for most people, most of the time, it's not going to be some big global world transforming event. It's going to be, I don't know, the death or suffering of someone really close to you that you might not be able to fit in with your belief system very well. And so then maybe you have to think harder about it. You have to talk to some people and I don't think there's an easy right way to think through those things, but arguments can help confirm our beliefs that we already have, and they can also act as evidence against it. And we have to deal with evidence against our beliefs sometimes. But overall, I don't think anybody's view of natural theology and reason should try to turn ordinary people into philosophers. So I don't think any ordinary person's rationality of belief in God hinges upon their grasping of a really good proof in natural theology. And I don't think in some sense there are any really good proofs in natural theology in some sense.
So just on maybe one of the first points that you made there, do you want to think then of people's beliefs maybe more in terms of what causes those beliefs? And is it about sort of, sometimes people are putting this emphasis on a kind of inner world that is, maybe there's a kind of metaphysics of some kind of a priori, and there's beliefs and reasons, and it's almost as, the model is almost as if a person's like picking, choosing beliefs out of this. And is your model almost more causal there? And how are you dividing that up in terms of the way that you're thinking of, you said the word, I think, to call it rational. I've heard other people call it like irrational, but they're not like making a judgment that it's wrong for things to be that way.
Yeah.
How does that fit together in your mind?
So I do have kind of a causal theory. If anyone wants to know the name of it, it's some sort of process reliabilism, and probably closest to Alvin Planigga's proper functionalism for the philosophers in the audience. But by and large, I think my belief that your shirt is plaid is rational if it's produced by a cognitive mechanism, which in this case is sort of perception, but it's not exactly, because I'm not perceiving your shirt. I'm perceiving an image of your shirt. But that image, I think, has to have your shirt as the cause. So for a perceptual belief, we have to be in the right relationship, causal relationship to the object that causes it. Now, suppose I say, my wife says, well, what was the guy wearing today? And I say, well, he was wearing a plaid shirt. And in that case, what justifies her belief is roughly that I tell her. But ultimately, somebody has to be in the right causal relationship. Your shirt has to be the cause of my belief that you're wearing a plaid shirt. But you're in a perceptual belief. The thing perceived has to be the cause, and then our cognitive faculties produce the belief immediately. So our cognitive faculties cause us to have beliefs when prompted in the right circumstance. So I don't take human beings to be mostly cogitators, like sitting around thinking, well, it looks like a plaid shirt. 99 times out of 100, if it looks like a plaid shirt, it is a plaid shirt. Therefore, it is a plaid shirt. Or I'm being appeared to plaid shirtedly. If I'm being appeared to plaid shirtedly, I have prima facie justification that
Yeah.
it is. There's all sorts of things that could go on, but I don't think they do go on in our heads, and I don't think they need to go on in our heads. Our cognitive faculties cause us to have beliefs, and when they're justified, then they have to have, for a perceptual belief, for example, it has to have the thing perceived as the cause for it to be some sort of justified perceptual belief. But there's all sorts of ways for us to be in touch with that. One is that I see an image of you that if it's produced by a camera and electrons, I don't even need to know the whole process. I have no idea how I know that. But anyway, that shirt has to be the cause of it. But I can also tell somebody, I could write it down. I could remember it later, but ultimately that shirt has to be the cause of my perceptual belief.
So then on the back to relating this to natural theology as well, and I promise the way that this question is framed, it's not like digging for a gotcha, like all these Christians owned or something. But I think some people who are religious, they almost a little bit of psychologizing, maybe it's uncharitable, but there's almost sometimes a sense of maybe insecurity or something that leads to a need to come up with a lot of like proofs for the belief, and a lot of a lot of engagement in natural theology driven by this kind of rationalist paradigm of requiring to have all the these proofs and engaging in a lot of argumentation around these things. So I'm just wondering then, from your point of view, like what was it? Were you always very comfortable with natural theology and proofs for religion not having this kind of role for you, or did you go through a phase where those sorts of things were a big role in your life, and then your views just changed on these questions of epistemology, and you were like, yeah, do you know what? Actually, this seems more faithful to what actually happens.
Yeah, so I totally get people who want there to be proofs, and I was exactly like that from age 18 to, I don't know, 24 or something like that. And I was like that, I think, for two reasons. One is I wanted to be able to give reasons to everybody. I was a really hardcore evangelist at the time, so I wanted to be able to give reasons to everybody on every occasion. But I also felt like I wanted reasons so that I could say, oh, there's good reason you're going to hell. It's so utterly obvious, it's like I could feel good if they rejected it, like they were rejecting obvious truth. And I was at an age, I think, where I needed to have that assurance that I was right and I alone was right, or me and my believing community was right. So I really wish Descartes had succeeded, that he had been able to prove everything from I exist, every important metaphysical and scientific truth about the world. I wish he had succeeded. I'm a failed Cartesian, and an unhappily failed Cartesian. But I think it's a model of knowledge that's impossible for human beings. And Descartes' Meditations was a massive failure, and anybody's attempt to ground their view of ultimate reality in widely accepted premises using easily seen inferences, I think, is just a mistake. Human beings just aren't that good at it. We're pretty good at predicting when it might rain, and remembering when crops should go in, and selecting mates, and caring for our kids, pretty good at it as a species. We're not so good at it as a species at metaphysical reflection.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, I think, is from Pascal towards Descartes, which is something like, I can't forgive Descartes because he would, he grants a click of the fingers to God, and then he has no further need of him in his theories or something. And
yeah. Once you get God, you get everything in Descartes. Like he can't get there.
Well, I guess even
he's allowed as proof, but once you get it, it's like everything follows.
And I feel like there's almost even something that seems almost impious in that to me. This is my personal values or whatever, but it's something like it reduces God to sort of like this aspect, like a hypothesis, or like, and that kind of maybe not even a great hypothesis, because like you say, it's non-contrastive. It's very, it gives you everything, even in a lot of modern terms, and it's like, what then the difference between, say, that and the practice of religion seems to be so vast to me, or the experience of religion, or the role that it might play in dealing with difficulties in your personal life. Like, that's just a massive difference to a kind of a proposed explanation of some sort of like a phenomena or something.
Yeah.
I've
been long opposed to the claim that Richard Swinburne treats God this way, Richard Dawkins treats God this way, J.L. Mackie treats God this way. Lots of Christians treat God as a hypothesis. And then he's put on the scale of the same scale by which we measure E equals mc squared, or the acceleration of gravity, or something like that. It's got to succeed or not succeed on those scales. And I view God as a person, and so I think that changes how we conceive of what it is to know God. And God is not a scientific hypothesis waiting for us to add up the evidence pro and con like we might for a scientific theory.
So that leads nicely then into the next question of faith. What is faith according to you?
So that's a good question, because I've been looking at more and more people like John Klonvig and Dan Howard Snyder, who take faith to be more non-cognitive than cognitive. I'm not entirely persuaded, by the way. I think there are lots of kinds of faith, let's put it that way. And if you're asking me, what about Christian faith, then I think it does have a cognitive, there's definitely a cognitive part to it. I don't know what that cognitive part is, by the way. I think it's got to be really small. One time I told some colleagues that I didn't think Christians had to believe in the Trinity in order to be Christians. And one colleague got really upset with me. And, the Trinity didn't become a doctrine of orthodoxy for at least 400 years. And I'd been to China and met many devout followers of Jesus who, I don't know if they had some well-developed view of the Trinity. They had the Bible. They were by and large just Bible believers. And they liked Jesus, and they didn't have a really highly metaphysical view of God. So I have no idea really if they believed or don't believe in the Trinity. I know they followed Jesus in the Bible, and a lot of them didn't like to read, like Western theology, because they wanted to get in touch with the first century Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospels. So, imagine just reading the Gospels and deriving your view of Jesus from that. So I'm not sure what the cognitive requirements are for faith, and for Christian faith anyway. I will say this: I grew increasingly tired of Christianity, and by that I mean what Kierkegaard means by like Christendom. You might think of Christian nationalism or something, like the kind of cultural accommodation that you see with Christians in the West. Pray and grow rich, for example. Don't pay taxes. Don't be kind to strangers or the poor. Immigrants are bad. There's all sorts of things I got really tired of. But I wrote a book with a friend who does literary narrative, biblical narrative. He's a literary scholar from the University of Chicago, but he was advancing in age, and I don't think his book would have seen the light of day, except I offered to help him write it. And I got, it was on the Gospels. It's called Written to be Heard. Like if the Gospels are written, if the Gospels weren't written for a long time, then people heard them orally. What did people hear? What are listening cues? Anyway, I really got into the discipline of thinking about listening cues and seeing chiasmic patterns and stuff like that, and hearing alliteration. And I came away really liking Jesus. I was not happy with 20th century American Christianity, but Jesus became really compelling to me in ways that he hadn't before, and was way more radical than I ever thought. Because I will say this, I by and large thought in my days when I was a real natural theologian that by and large Christianity was for getting us into heaven and avoiding hell. And I really wanted to avoid hell, so I could delay some gratification if I could be pretty sure I was going to get into heaven. And writing a book on Jesus of the Gospels began for me to see that faith involves following Jesus. And following Jesus means being radically inclusive of the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And if you're not doing that, then you're not following Jesus. Anyway, that's a long way of saying I don't know exactly what the cognitive element is, and
just to clarify, sorry, the cognitive element you're saying in terms of, are there like necessary conditions in terms of beliefs or something like that?
Yeah,
is that
what exactly you're supposed to believe to be a Christian? I knew it when I was 18. I don't really know it now. Now I'm way more dubious about anyone who says this is a necessary and sufficient condition of Christian belief. I don't know that.
I wonder then, it's interesting what you said about also the heaven and hell thing, because I've got a friend who, now he's more focused on promoting sort of MAGA politics, but he used to be very interested in, as an atheist, talking to Christians. And one of his quite effective strategies, the sort of more fundamentalist people was to kind of reduce people's entire theology to carrots and sticks. He'd say, so it's just carrots and sticks.
Exactly.
And even though it's rhetorical, it would be incredibly effective, because for a lot of people, that's kind of what it bottomed out to in terms of the reasons that they would give. It wasn't, a kind of duty towards the good, or, a real care for the poor and needy or something like that. Instead, it was really just, it just bottomed out as you must say and believe kind of a collection of things. Why? Because bad thing and good thing if you bad thing if you don't, good thing if you do, and really kind of like crass sort of theology. So it's interesting. That was
I had Marilyn Adams, who's a philosopher who's famous for her critiques of hell, and she gave a talk at Calvin University, a Christian university, and a lot of students were really upset, and one even voiced it, but most of the Christians thought it. They just said, well, why should I believe now? If there's no hell, like why bother believing? And she said, well, because it's good for you. And it was pretty clear they were thinking, why do I get up early on Sunday mornings and spend that time going to church? And why am I not having all the sex I want and going out and getting drunk? Why am I avoiding these things if it's not, setting me up for an eternity in paradise? If I can just do anything I want and get away with it. And it was clear to me that the immediate carrot wasn't good enough. And really what was motivating was this stick, the stick of hell. And that's what really was motivating them. And they didn't like her answer. It wasn't really good enough. They wanted them some hell.
There's something I find even interesting in that, though, where it seems to me that this is going to be very sort of wishy-washy anecdotal, but when I've seen people move away from that theology, even towards, you know, atheism, if they were professing Christians, there's a sense in which I can construe that as them becoming better Christians, because sometimes, you know, they then start to care more about certain social causes or the good of other people, because they've kind of like deconstructed maybe a part of their theology that was just focused on like getting people to say sentences rather than seeing them as people and caring about them and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's that fear of hell that really does, you know, gives that drive to those sorts of things.
Yeah. My best friend in graduate school was an atheist, but a lapsed Mennonite. And I really learned from him, and he really learned from his parents to care for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. Like that wasn't on my radar, but it is on the Mennonite radar, and he got it more on mine. And I really learned things from him, even though probably at the time I was way more distrustful of atheists than I should have been, and probably thought I didn't need to learn much from anybody except fellow Christians. I just needed to read Christian authors and think, and the Bible, and hang around with Christians and think Christian thoughts. And well, that all changed in graduate school, but he really showed me what it looks like to follow Jesus. The kingdom of God is here. It's now. It's on earth. It's a kingdom of justice and righteousness. And I learned, and I went to tell his parents one time, who I knew his family was dismayed that he wasn't a believer, but I wanted to tell him, you know, you did a good job raising this guy. You know, you should be proud. He's way ahead of lots of Christians in terms of righteousness and justice and peace on earth.
So some people, when it comes to this question of faith, will approach it as sort of like faith is belief with insufficient evidence or something, or, you know, there's even a book that at least was popular about 10 years ago that said, you know, it's like a faulty epistemology, and we need to replace faith with you know, these better ways of knowing that we have now. I mean, do you think that? I mean, it's kind of a loaded question, but you know, what do you think that type of analysis of faith is getting wrong? Like you know, it's belief with insufficient evidence, or it's like it's just kind of like wishful thinking or a bad way of knowing or something.
Yeah. Well, I think most of us do believe on insufficient evidence, but I think that's just true. That's the human condition, and we take all sorts. I don't mean to diminish it for Christian belief, but we believe all sorts of things without sufficient evidence, and all of our metaphysical and most of our religious beliefs are ones that we believe without sufficient evidence. At least the evidence isn't compelling. That you know, we see through a glass darkly, and if you think, I guess I would put it this way: do you think your epistemic, suppose there is a God and there is a afterlife, and you come to God face to face, do you think your epistemic situation will improve? And if you don't think it will improve a lot, then I think you don't understand either the glory of the beatific vision or the kind of epistemic darkness, you know, we face now. I think we can see enough to follow Jesus in this life and give us hope for the next. But it's seeing enough, and it's seeing through a glass darkly. So I wouldn't want to contrast Christian faith with, you know, atheism and say one of them is better off in terms of having compelling evidence. I think all of our really deeply fundamental kind of high metaphysical beliefs is underdetermined by the evidence. And again, I think that's the human condition. And my hope is that God is, you know, understanding of our contingency and finitude, and what we've been, what our cognitive equipment has been given for. It's not to make evidently it's not to make all of us really great physicists. We don't understand E = mc², I don't think it's to figure out the intricacies of the Trinity. I don't think anyone's pulled it off yet. So what's it for? To do justice and love mercy and walk humbly before your God. I think that we have enough to do that, and that's enough for one lifetime.
On the Trinity, my friend had an idea for a game show, which would be you kind of invite theologians on to speak for as long as they can about the Trinity continuously, and whoever gets the longest time wins, and they have to stop as soon as they've committed a heresy. So that's the the game for the Trinity.
I like that. It won't have a big audience, but I would like it and think it's pretty funny.
Yeah. So next
I'm a big
question
fan
then.
of heresies, by the way.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
It's just so easy for anyone to go wrong. But in the history of the Christian church, everyone acts like it's not easy to go wrong, and they act like it's easy to go right, and they know what's right. And anyway, I think
right.
more power to people trying to figure out what God is like, what Christianity is, what it means to follow Jesus, even if other people think you're making a big mistake.
So with respect to then Reformed epistemology, I mean, I'm sure you've been asked a million times to kind of like spell out the theory, and I'll ask you again. But I'm also interested in what your personal experience has been with Reformed epistemology in philosophy of religion. Like, how have you seen it be received and transformed within philosophy of religion? Do you think that? Do you think that there was like it's changed the field in important ways, or maybe it's not done that? Like, what are your personal experiences with it just kind of coming into academia?
Yeah. So I grew up, as I said, philosophically as kind of a Cartesian, looking for proofs for everything that I believed. And I started reading work in epistemology, and I was reading a lot of work on anti-foundationalism, that we don't have an absolutely certain foundation for knowledge. And even if we did, what is absolutely certain is not robust enough evidence to prove all of our metaphysical and moral beliefs and religious beliefs. So that was all independent of Reformed epistemology, just reading in general in 20th century epistemology. I think most people who are interested in epistemology need to come to terms with the fact that that we either don't have an absolutely certain foundation of knowledge, or the foundation is so pitiful it doesn't really establish anything much of importance. Like, I don't think there's any successful proof of the external world, or any successful proof that that there was a past, or as Bertrand Russell said, that we weren't created 5 minutes ago with our memories intact, or that the future will be like the past. The list could go on and on. I think the failure of classical foundationalist epistemology is pretty well explored in 20th century epistemology. And again, I wasn't happy about it. I was a reluctant convert to Reformed epistemology. And what started me on the path was becoming increasingly aware of the failures of classical foundationalism, independent of reading Planigga and Walterstorff and Alston and others. I wrote a master's thesis comparing Planigga and Wittgenstein on groundless belief. So Wittgenstein I actually think Wittgenstein is some kind of religious believer.
He converted to Catholicism, actually, just before he died, had a Catholic burial.
Oh, no kidding. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I know a lot about him. I love Wittgenstein. I've read tons of stuff. Anyway, in his work on groundless believing, he sees a lot of the failures of classical foundationalism. So I compared him to Alvin Planigga's Reformed epistemology, and that was my first foray into Reformed epistemology. And again, I wished for better. I wished for utterly compelling proofs based on irrefutable premises. That's what I wished for, and began to think that's just not the way it is. And then I went to Notre Dame for my PhD, and Planigga ended up being my dissertation director. And I looked at arguments for and against the existence of God. I compared, this is when there two things were happening. One is Reformed epistemology was in its infancy, so there's very little that had been written at the time. The other is rationalist epistemology was being revived. Richard Swinburne had recently published his book, The Existence of God, and J.L. Mackie had published The Miracle of Theism. So what I looked at is how two pretty smart people could come to exactly opposite conclusions about the existence of God, allegedly on the basis of the same evidence. And I basically looked at how, what a probabilistic argument is and how you might assign values to the probabilities. And at any rate, my last chapter was on Reformed epistemology, and my first book was a defense of Reformed epistemology, Return to Reason. And I think it did reform the field, no pun intended. I remember being at St. Andrews. I had a sabbatical there in 95, 96, and Timothy Williamson was there, and he was a Michael Dummett student. And Dummett was all the rage at the time, and Timothy Williamson, who now is, I think, one of the great living philosophers in the world, was then just a young guy, super smart. But we were out for a drink after his talk, and I said something about Dummett's Catholicism, and people were really shocked. Like, they didn't know. They only knew him for his work on logic. But Timothy Williamson knew, and we talked about it. And Williamson, who's, as far as I can tell, is an atheist, said that he could understand how people could believe. There was another philosopher there. I remember one time, and I don't think he knew yet that I was a Planigga student, but anyway, he said something about that Planigga has made it nearly respectable to be a religious believer again. And these were all atheists. I'm sitting in this room with all atheists, and the only guy that fully took my side was Timothy Williamson, and he sort of sympathetically understood his dissertation director, Michael Dummett. And anyway, we had this interesting talk over a pint in the end, about Reformed epistemology. And then I ended up giving a talk there at St. Andrews, and a lot of people don't like it, I think, because they make an exception for religious belief. They become really strong evidentialists for religious belief, even though if you talk to them in general about their epistemology, they're not really strong evidentialists, because they think there isn't really strong evidence for most of our, again, metaphysical beliefs. So, but God, religious belief, that's something that really needs to be held to a higher standard for some reason. So it has made a huge impact, and I've seen it over the years, the impact that it's made. It's influenced a lot of philosophers, and I think it's emboldened a lot of philosophers who are Christians to be Christian philosophers, not just and kind of developing their worldview without thinking they have to prove it first. So when I was first in grad school, people wrote about religious epistemology and theistic arguments. But in a few years, you started to hear papers about the incarnation and the Trinity and atonement and Christian virtues, and the list could go on, but no one was doing that in the late 70s and early 80s, because Christianity was off the table. And Planigga and Walterstorff and Alston and Mavrodes put God back on the table. People could think in really creative ways.
Do you think that there's any influence between the sort of like knowledge first epistemology stuff and the kind of Plantingan influence, or do you think it's more sort of independent there in Tim Williamson's work?
Well, I think it's independent. Like, I think a lot of Christians that got interested in knowledge first probably. I think people independently got tired of thinking of the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, independent of belief in God. And then I think Jonathan Hawthorne figured out, A, he was at Oxford and Templeton likes to fund people at famous places. And B, well, here's something no one has really explored for religious reasons. But I think it was pretty independent of Reformed epistemology, except that probably a lot of people that like Reformed epistemology ended up being part of that project. I don't fully understand it myself, so I don't have much to say about knowledge first epistemology.
Yeah, no worries. And then like on so some people have become like kind of critical of what they might call like standard analytic epistemology, and it sounds like some of their complaints are maybe like present in what you're saying as well. I mean, how do you then think of like what the aims of epistemology as a subject? Because I think, you know, I come across this kind of attitude, I guess, from some people as well, which is that, I don't know, that like you're profaning epistemology by not asking, you know, these big questions about the conceptual analysis of knowledge and you know, setting these like high standards that carve nature at the or carve metaphysical reality at the joints in terms of understanding, you know, the way that beliefs fit together and things. I mean, do you have a role for epistemology that you view then as almost just being like a kind of more modest way of improving our beliefs or realistically understanding what we do? Or is there still, you know, like I guess I'm trying to understand then, is there like a grander aim in the philosophical side of inquiry there?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways to look at philosophy, and one is to look at it as kind of regulative. And so you're going to come up with principles that should regulate how people believe. And if they don't live up to those principles, then they're either irrational or unjustified. And maybe people are even immoral. We tend to think people who disagree with us are immoral, and sometimes even we'll just say they're crazy. They're just crazy for that. And I think that sort of regulative epistemology has been a failure. But I think there's another way to understand epistemology, and that is to try to understand when things go right, when we know things, when things go right. What is it that happens when things go right? And so this is philosophy is understanding, not philosophy is regulating. And so I stopped reading analytic epistemology maybe 15 years ago or so, because, and then I started working in the cognitive sciences, and initially in the cognitive science of religion, because I wanted to see how our minds really work, what really goes on when information somehow gets into our minds and gets processed and outputs beliefs or behavior, what really happens. And so I have grown almost completely to try to understand how, when cognition is successful, when we acquire true beliefs, how it happens. So that's a different aim for epistemology. I'd say I was more in the regulative camp, so I really wanted the necessary and sufficient conditions. I wanted to be able to tell people they were irrational and that I could show them from philosophy. But by and large, that sort of practice is just autobiographical. We think people who disagree with us are irrational. We think it already. And I don't think it's conducive to our character to think that everyone who disagrees with us is irrational or immoral or crazy. I think it's bad for us, and that we should understand how it is someone might have come to a belief that's different from ours, and to do that sympathetically, instead of arrogantly, standing on high and looking down on those poor, pathetic people who are irrational. I gave a talk. There's a lecture series in Zagreb, and I gave a talk on God and the Brain, and I I said that I thought most people most of the time were rational, and there was a new atheist that was there, like a new atheist. He's a critic of Dawkins and Dennett, but he clearly was some kind of evidentialist. And anyway, I went out afterwards for a drink with him, and the guy I really quite liked him. But anyway, he told me his daughter had just converted to Roman Catholicism. And I said, well, do you think she's irrational? And he wasn't happy that I asked him that. And, but I guess that's where you sort of test it. People with whom you already have some sympathy, but who hold a belief that's really different from yours. Do you really think
Yeah, yeah.
she's defective in her trying to figure out the truth? And then I found out later that his wife is a Roman Catholic too. So, but he did clearly say he told me anyone who has a religious belief is irrational. They're not just wrong, they're irrational. And I just don't get that.
I feel that rationality is just so cheap, like it's just, almost for most people, it's just going to be like mere consistency or something, right? Like,
Well,
you
I
can,
think it's pretty cheap. Actually, I think most people are rational most of the time. It's not exactly meritorious, but I think what we want to do is look at people who disagree with us and then be able to look down on them. And so it's not especially meritorious to be rational, but it's a vice to look down on people who you disagree with. And that's what we use. That's what we use our sort of intuitive criteria of rationality for.
Right. And then, so when it comes to, I mean, I do have a question then about like the negative sides of this. And I guess, it's similar to what you're saying there is, this isn't to say the view is wrong or that, like groundless belief is wrong or something, but I think that it can also very easily be used as a kind of like Mott and Bailey tactic almost by some people, where they might, make very speculative or outlandish claims, but then they can always sort of like almost like make those, it's like almost a cheat code or something, like you're playing chess one moment, but then when it becomes the other person's turn, they can remove the board or something, you can't play your move anymore, because they can say, well, there's this kind of it's a groundless belief, it's a properly basic belief, and the criteria are very difficult to even challenge or get your hands on kind of. And I wonder if you've come across that, and how, even as someone who is obviously a reformed epistemologist, if you provide pushback on that, and if so, how, so
yeah. So I've heard Alvin Planigga sometimes, like in China one time, people asked him why he believed in God, and he defended reformed epistemology, which in one way is perfectly fine, but in another way, it's entirely audience insensitive. These are people that, by and large, religious belief has been beaten out of Chinese people. And so they were in the reason. He should have moved into the reason giving mode, not in the I don't need reason mode. And so sometimes I feel like it is a cheap trick to pull out. I don't think technically he was wrong, but there was this audience there, and he missed the audience, and the audience wanted some reasons. And even though I'm a reformed epistemologist, I don't think there are no reasons for belief in God. And so I don't think people believe in the absence of reason. I just think it's not, utterly compelling. But depends on who's asking and what the circumstances are and how sincere they're asking. And I think they were sincere. They want to know, like, I think a lot of people in China after the collapse of the basically of communism, they still have communism in the title, but they're not. There ain't. It's probably the most capitalist country in the world. And so I think a lot of young people were kind of looking around and seeing what the options are. And here's this great philosopher from America, and anyway, missed the opportunity.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great answer, sort of like highlighting, highlighting the pragmatics and the kind of like almost infelicitousness of a certain way of acting. Yeah, like missing the opportunity to maybe have a better conversation there. And so, talking about your time in China and obviously experience of these other religions, you were mentioning doing work to be edifying to your, you referred to your Muslim brothers and sisters. Like, some Christians are very sort of sectarian, right? They have a view of people are on the other team, and they're kind of wrong, and that is reflected in their philosophy, their theological reflections as well. I mean, from your point of view, how has understanding and learning about different faiths influenced your views of Christian theology and even improved and built on it?
So I've written books with Muslims and Jews, and my first foray was a book called Abraham's Children, which Yale University Press published, and Jimmy Carter, U.S. president, wrote for it, and the former president of Indonesia, the first democratically elected president of Indonesia, wrote for it, and he wrote the best piece. It was really powerful, and what I try to do is get people to speak from their own faith perspectives. So I try to get people to write in defense of liberty and tolerance from their own faith perspectives, and I don't require anyone who's in any projects with me to agree with me or to think that we should agree at some bottom basic level, that you can just boil religious belief in the Abrahamic traditions down to things that everyone agrees on. And so I don't, I'm not a least common denominator sort of interfaith person. I am this kind of person. Each of our traditions tells us that we're supposed to love people who are different from us. And even though religion has made most of us more tribal, nothing could be clearer, I think, than that God wanted to bless Abraham so that blessing could go out to all the people of the world, that everyone would be included. And even if you don't think that exactly, then you still should think that everyone is created in the image of God. And that image isn't erased because people have beliefs that are different from yours. And what I find in a lot of Christians is they want to, they want to, they not only want to think the beliefs are different, they want to think that, especially with Muslims, like Jews usually get a pass on Christians, but I think that they think Islam is inherently violent, and so they want to think the beliefs of Muslims make them more likely to be violent and vicious, and I think that's not true. And I've tried to overcome that, not from saying that I'm tempted to be a Muslim, but to let people understand what Islam is better and help them kind of meet Muslims through what I write. I tell a lot of stories about Muslims, and again, I'm not trying to proselytize for Islam, but I am trying to get Christians to live out Jesus' challenge to love your neighbor as yourself, and to love goes all the way to enemy. And I think a lot of Christian, and I don't think Muslims are our enemy. So, but I think a lot of people think that, and then that needs to be overcome. So I try to create interfaith experiences where people can meet people who are different from them, and you can meet people, and you don't even, by and large, you don't talk about your faith. You talk about, what are you growing in your garden, and do you have any kids, and where'd you go to school, and you find out that almost all human beings love their children, want better lives for their children, and are willing to make sacrifices for their children. I find that with people, because most of the people I deal with are older. But even with college students, I just find, they want to get a degree and get a job and live in peace. They surprisingly like America, and a lot of them want to come here. And I say surprisingly because we've dropped a lot of bombs on Muslim majority countries and destabilized the Middle East. So it does surprise me sometimes how kind Muslims are to us. By us, I mean United States.
So sometimes, at least like in particular in recent times, there's a lot of people, particularly high-profile kind of like public figures, talking about the importance of Christianity and Christian values in order to confront the threat of Islam. The kind of
Yeah,
yeah,
even Richard Dawkins, like all of a
yeah.
sudden he likes Christianity.
And even a lot of, and then there's also a lot of apologists, I suppose, who, because they're very eager for people to be saying something positive about Christianity, they're reaching immediately to have these people kind of talk about the value of Christianity and stuff. I mean, how do you view what these people's views of Christian values are, when it comes to their engagement with Islamic cultures and Islamic theology? Do you think that they are accurately characterizing Christian values, and if not, like, why not?
So it's easy to think based on the media and incidences of terrorism that get blown up. So again, no pun intended. But people are terrorists. So I don't think terrorists are crazy or irrational. I think there's a disproportion in power, and both sides have some sort of U.S. and terrorists have Islamic terrorists have some sorts of ideologies, but no one's killed more innocent people in the past 20 years than the United States. We may have indirectly killed over a million people, mostly women and children, in Iraq, because 20 years ago we dropped bombs and destroyed their infrastructure, and it hasn't recovered to this day. We unleashed ISIS because Saddam Hussein kept them in control, but when the U.S. went into Iraq, they got rid of the military and the police. So ISIS all of a sudden wasn't kept in bay, and they ran amok, and they started doing stuff all over the world. So, and religious Christian beliefs were used to justify all that. George Bush Jr. said that he prayed to God, and God told him to go, and they were headed over, we're dropping bombs. God bless America. The Christian right was totally on the side of that. But by and large, I don't think Muslims that I know blame Christian beliefs. There are some that do, there's no doubt about it, but by and large, they don't. They sort of excuse Christianity for how it got used by politicians in the past 20 or 30 years. And the other thing is, you talk about people that want Christian beliefs and practices, they like the cultural side of Christianity. There are lots of parts of Islam that I really don't like, and I wish they would stop. I think women are not treated well in practice in a lot of Muslim majority countries. Of course, women weren't treated well in practice in Western countries either for a long time. And but it's still bad. I'm helping a Muslim friend write a book on Islam and women. So there are things I don't like about it, and I can see why you wouldn't want those to become widely practiced in your culture, because you think it dehumanizes people. Even if they freely choose it, it still dehumanizes them. So I think that we have to be able to talk to one another and even say things in the right context of where we can say things we don't like about each tradition, even really seriously don't like. But we're not good we haven't built the bridges that we need to have those sorts of conversations. And they take a lot of work, but it takes, we got this log in our own eye about the Christian support for politics that kill people who are different from us. And then there's a splinter in our eye for the 13 who were killed by a suicide bomber or something like that, not the millions that are killed by our bombs and drones and et cetera.
My view, I've been meaning to try and get some people on, in particular about the causes of like Islamic terrorism, right? And the reason is because I've kind of followed loosely some of these discussions between, like people like Sam Harris, for example, and there's a guy called Scott Atran. And
he's fantastic. Sam Harris is terrible.
Yeah, when you look into like experts in the psychology of, you know, the causes of extremism, and, you know, people doing direct interviews with these people, or, you know, engaging in like sociological explanations. It's just the idea that it's doctrine that causes it is just, it just doesn't fit. You know,
No.
it can't explain the differences. It can't explain differences in historical time periods, and it just doesn't fit with what these people say themselves. So yeah, I think that it's just this maybe a really convenient explanation for people, or just very easy thing to sort of say, I guess. Yeah.
I've done a lot of work on religion and violence, and I'll send you a piece on in response to some of the people that blame violence on Islamic belief. I think people fight by and large when their children are threatened, or when they are threatened, or feel threatened, or they fight over land. They fight for honor and shame. There are a lot of they fight when their group is attacked. There are lots of reasons people fight. Pretty low on the list is whether or not someone agrees with you about the Trinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that leads into the next question, which is, obviously, it's not about the relationship between Islamic sort of faith and their politics, but the other sort of side of the coin with respect to Western politics. You know, what's the relationship between authentic, and I put authentic in quotes just because, like you, I'm sort of skeptical of what the necessary conditions would be for, you know, Christian faith. I'm not really quite sure that there is anything explicitly that I could put my finger on, but yeah, like what is the relationship between that and politics? Because I think something I see, I think particularly in American evangelical communities, you know, phrases kind of like, you know, it's I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, or, you know, that, well, that's a political issue, but you know, my faith's a different thing. But then often giving direct theological justifications for the values that they hold, and how that informs how they vote, and how they think, you know, geopolitics and laws should be passed, and all these sorts of things. And so it seems to me that there is quite a deep connection between people's religious expression and, you know, their kind of like politics, how they think they should live, arrange societies. You know, so from your point of view, like, what should that relationship be? How should people conceive of, you know, what Christian values are, and how that relates to their political engagement in the world?
Yeah. So I'd say on a lot of things, I'm almost a libertarian. And so I'm a maximal freedom guy. And I've been to Muslim majority countries and seen what it's like for people that aren't in the Muslim majority, and it's not good. Jews have been hounded out of almost every Muslim majority country. Christians are persecuted in many Muslim majority countries, maybe most. Like, things are pretty good in Turkey, but Christians can't hold any public offices in Turkey. You know, they're not getting killed, but they are discriminated against. And Muslims are discriminated against in America. In America, in China, there are 1 million Uyghurs, Muslims, who are in concentration camps. And China's solution to the so-called Uyghur minority problem is that they've put Han Chinese men into the homes of the men they've taken out, and they have their way with the wives. And then any children that they have will be mixed. And you do that for a few generations and everyone will be mixed. So they're trying to dilute the Muslim so-called race. So everywhere there's an ideology that's in charge, people that aren't in the majority get hurt. So I'm by and large a maximal freedom guy. And I think Christians should be maximal freedom people. And yet in the United States, Christians are really highly tempted to inflict their own moral values on everybody. They want, they have views on LGBTQ, views on trans, that they find really offensive. They find the woke views on those sorts of issues really offensive, and they want to make laws about them. And I just think it's a big mistake. For one thing, LGBTQ people who are created in the image of God are getting hurt already. It's bad enough. They don't need to be unprotected by courts. So in general, I'm not a fan of any religion that has its own distinctive beliefs getting inserted into politics. In Saudi Arabia, you can be, and people are killed for being an atheist. I have a Muslim friend in Egypt who's afraid to leave the house because he's gay and he thinks he's going to be burned to death. And it's taken a long time in the United States and the UK for gay people to feel like maybe they won't get beat up if they go out. And Christianity has contributed to that. So anyway, I'm a maximal freedom person. On the other hand, I think there might be or should be areas on which Christians and government and people can agree, like caring for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And government should be involved in that. If there's enough money, like I don't think there's anybody has sort of a natural right to all this, but if you live in a rich country that has the money and can care for like no one should starve in the U.S. There should be places for widows to go. And I don't think the church fills the need. I think a lot of Christians think, well, the church should do that. The church will do that. But the need is vastly greater than what the church can do. So if a country has funds and can do this, I think people should have health care. People should have food. People should be able to live in safety. So I don't think these are distinctly Christian values. So I'm in favor of governments doing these things, and I don't see this. So I'm an anti-Trumper. I don't see Trump. I'm an anti-Christian nationalist because I'm a maximal freedom person. I also don't like the cuts to the social safety net that we're seeing in the U.S. I'm against waste, fraud, and abuse. So totally on board with that. Let's get rid of all the waste, fraud, and abuse. But even when that's gone, there's still going to be a need for poor people to have food, to have better access to education, to have healthcare. There'll be a huge need, and I think the government should meet it. So I don't have a really big government theory, but that's roughly what I think. And I will say this, somebody on Facebook, like some young Christian chided me because he thought that I was moved by woke liberality in the university. And I've resisted and been chastised by people in the university for defending Christian values and being a Christian believer. So it's kind of ironic that, and this has happened publicly in many places. And so I find it ironic, but the biggest single influence on me is a book by Ron Sider called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. And that book is really, I read that when it first came out in probably the mid 70s when it first came out. And it had a huge influence on me. Interestingly, his son, Ted Sider, would become my student 20 years later and become one of the most famous philosophers in the world. But his father had a huge influence on me. And the influence was getting me to see what following Jesus meant for caring for people who were oppressed and hungry and poor and needy. And the call is pretty radical. So that was the biggest influence on me, not woke university professors. I don't really care what they think.
So in terms of like the values, he's written 2 books that I've read. He wrote the Riddles of Existence book and the Logic for Philosophy book. I didn't actually know. Interesting. Anyway,
Ted is one of I think he's the highest paid philosopher in the world now, but
and the Tools of Metaphysics book. Cool, interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, I just hadn't put it together, and I didn't like the name hadn't kind of stuck with me for some reason.
I don't think people put them together. Obviously, Ted, I'm pretty sure, is an atheist, and his father is a very devout
Right.
and like a serious follower of Jesus. His father is,
Right.
he's
Right.
inspiring.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my question is about the values in theology here, though, as well, because what I see a lot in a lot of sort of like populist movements politically is the appeal to and use of like Christian symbolism and tropes and motifs. So, I don't know if you saw the spat between J.D. Vance and Rory Stewart, who's used to be a politician in the UK, where J.D. Vance was saying, the reason that we've got to cut USAID is because of the Ordo Amoris. It's the
Yeah. Oh, I did see
Augustinians.
that.
Yeah, and so or people appealing to Christian values to build a Christian nation in a very particular kind of way. And I guess the idea is then, as you say, the woke, who are the secular, is anyone who opposes, this kind of univocal idea of Christianity that is, clearly politically operating in this one particular way. And how do you go about communicating to these people who are very vocal about Christianity playing this role in their politics that isn't necessarily or essentially Christianity?
Well, I'd say I'm not very effective at that. I try. I write blogs. I used to write for the Huffington Post, and I think we're too siloed right now, informationally siloed, so people can't hear. Like I think a lot of Republicans don't realize that Trump's big beautiful budget is going to explode the deficit. I don't think it's a secret. It's really easy to find this out, but I think a lot of people just don't know. And I can say it on Facebook or something. I could write something. People have to write things. People have to try to communicate. But I'm pretty discouraged about people's ability to. I'm way more encouraged about my ability to communicate with Muslims, and than I am with fellow Christians on these matters. And I think there's a lot of pride that goes into this. I won't say just on the other side, but I find there's a kind of triumphalism on the side of Trumpers and MAGA-ers, and a kind of reveling in a lack of information, and a reveling in anti-science and anti-expertise and anti-universities. Well, if you do that, then you're cutting yourself off from a lot of information, but even really smart people seem to be doing that. So I'm pretty discouraged about our ability to communicate on these matters. And I think it's really hard not to think more highly of oneself than one ought, whatever side one is on in this case, because the rhetoric is so inflammatory now. And the Ordo Amoris, which I do in principle agree with. I love my children more than I love anybody else's children, but it's used as a tool not to love people who are outside of your tribe. Well, then you just missed it. Like you didn't get that Jesus concedes the Ordo Amoris, but says, love your neighbor as yourself. Like that's the thing you're supposed to be working towards. But it got used as a tool not to love people who are different from you, or who are outside of your Ordo. Well, no one's outside of your Ordo. Everyone's in it. Everyone's in your circle. That's the Jesus message. And it's way harder to love people who are different from you. And it's way harder when you fear them. And so that means we need to work to overcome those fears. But Vance and Trump try their hardest to increase those fears. And then it makes it really hard to love people who are different from us, or even to care.
So, I mean, that's all of the questions that I've had. There were a couple that I saw come in the chat throughout where Harley Wicks asks, would you consider yourself a fideist or would you reject that label? He said in another comment. I'll leave it up there.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Harley. A fideist is a bad word. It's like being a communist or a fundamentalist. If you call somebody that, it's a bad thing. It means someone who believes by faith alone, usually, or in opposition to reason or opposed to reason. I don't think my belief is in opposition to reason. I don't think it's opposed to reason. I think reasons play some role in my beliefs, some confirmatory role, and have played a role in me thinking that I have some obligation to respond to evidence against my beliefs, although I don't think everybody has to do that. I don't really care if I'm a fideist or not, so it is a bad word for some people, but I don't believe against reason or in opposition to reason. I think my belief is a reasonable belief. So I'll just leave it at that.
And so this question is from Sapir Olday, and he asks, why think there's any ultimate reality? And just to maybe add a bit of context to this, I think where he's coming from is like at the start of the conversation when we were talking about like your views of natural theology and reasons about ultimate reality. I think he's thinking more in line with the criticisms about how epistemically opaque the world is, you know, our abilities to even understand what we're talking about when we talk about these sorts of things can be highly questionable. And maybe he's thinking, you know, maybe we should just think more into, maybe we should conceptualize our life more in terms of our immediate experiences, the world around us, the social world we actually exist in, rather than even speculating about this kind of stuff. And then maybe there's a role for religion in that. What are your thoughts?
So the way you put it in the end, if that's what he means, I do think that we're supposed to be way more concerned about doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly before our God than spending a lot of time in metaphysical speculation. Now, I'm a professional philosopher, so I like that. I read papers in high level. I just read a paper on how modal realism might be true, and God might still be good and the creator of the world. And that's a really highly philosophical question that hardly anybody will know. And I got a kick out of the paper. I didn't write it, but I liked reading. It was a friend of mine. I gave comments on it. So I like thinking about these things, but I just think as a Christian, we should think, well, we just don't have enough information, and God seems to think it was not that important to give us that information. But there is information God gave us, and the information is do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before our God. I think that's just throughout the whole narrative of Scripture, and thinking whether a God is simple or not, or inside or outside of time. Well, really interesting. I get a kick out of those things, but I just think we don't have enough information to settle them. So I don't think we should get too worried about any of those.
Awesome. Roman Omen asks, does the guest agree with Richard Rohr's sentiment that our religion or ethos informs and is integrated with our politics?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It definitely informs it. As I said, I'm an anti-religion, get involved in the state, but it does inform what I think a state should do if it has the resources, and it should do things that are in line with what I think my religion thinks are good things to be done. So, yeah, I guess I would agree. I don't know what Richard Rohr means exactly by that. I tend to kind of like things Richard Rohr says. So, but I guess I do think it informs integrates, as long as it's not anything that's just distinctly Christian or distinctly Muslim or distinctly communist, then I think that's a problem.
Joe Blow asks, what interplay / overlap, if any, between the prosperity gospel and Christian nationalism do you think there is?
I think there's a big overlap. I think a lot of, sociologically, I think there's a big overlap. I actually think that the biggest motivation for Christian nationalism is that white Christian males feel like they're the most persecuted people in the world and are losing their dominance. And so I think there's a racism and a sexism that's really moving Christian nationalism. So that, I think, is the real mover and shaker behind it. I think it was a big mistake to have a African-American woman run at that time. And I think it was a mistake not to have some sort of open election for the candidate who was running. But anyway, I think it would have been difficult to overestimate the power of misogyny and racism in America. I think it's just been unleashed. People just can say it out loud now, where they kept it in before. I think that's the single biggest motivating factor.
Yeah, and the constant normalizing of taboos as kind of like ironic jokes and things, and plausible deniability and things.
Yeah.
WASF asks, what do you think about environmental issues and religion? So I guess maybe the core of the issues, like, is climate change a problem, and is that consistent with Christian theology?
Yeah, I think that global climate warming is the biggest. It may be already, but it certainly will be the biggest human-made disaster in the history of the world. And we all have our heads in the sand. And religion has, in America, I think in general, people are not good at being future planners. So we can see, we're just most people are trying to do their best to get through today and maybe something in a week, but not 20 years. Human beings, I think, are not cognitively disposed to be good future planners. So, but religion has added to that, especially Christianity. So my brother, who is a very conservative Christian, thinks that, it's all in God's hands. Things get hot sometimes, things get cold. God will take care of us. Of course, he wears a seat belt and keeps to the speed limit and wears glasses. God doesn't take care of everything. So I think religion in the U.S. is a pretty serious obstacle to making any progress on global climate warming. And I think it's a massive moral failure. And I think there's nothing to be done about it for 4 years, and it will just get exponentially worse for 4 years, because Americans use the most, burn the most fossil fuels of any country in the world. So it's just going to accelerate things.
And Frank Pickle asks, what do you think it takes to get to heaven?
Well, Frank, if anyone wants a free download of my book, God and the Problems of Love, from Cambridge University Press, it's free, God and the Problems of Love, and I have a chapter on hell, and I'm not favorably inclined towards hell. So what does it take to get into heaven? That God loves us like a father or mother loves their child. That's what it takes to get in.
And would you consider, actually, just to say, I'm just putting the link as well to some of your books that are available for free in the description, so they'll be there in a second. And would you consider yourself like a universalist in terms, or like in line with like David Bentley Hart's sort of work on this? Or
I think that I'm either a universalist or some kind of annihilationist, that if there are people who in the long run, after God keeps trying to coax them into heaven, don't want to be there, that they'll cease existing. And but I have no idea. Like, it's one of those ultimate reality things that I don't have a commitment on. I spoke on this in a couple of weeks ago, and someone in the audience said they didn't want heaven to be a place where Hitler could go. And well, I guess I don't want to be in the same club as Hitler either, but I feel like I'm closer to Hitler than I am to Jesus. So in some ways, I probably should be more open to the wideness of God's mercy. Again, I'm not a fan of Hitler. I have no idea if Hitler is going to get into heaven. I have no idea if Hitler's going to spend eternity in hell. Or if Hitler will be annihilated. I don't think Hitler will be in an eternal torture chamber where God keeps him awake and burns him daily. I don't think it's going to be like that. But I also don't think people can exist for eternity and not just go crazy. So there won't be a person there after a while if they're cut off from anything that makes us flourish as human beings. Then I think people cannot survive for eternity like that. So they'll just go crazy.
And Anam Irreview asks, do you think that Islam needs a reformation in the same way that Christianity's had one?
Yeah, the Muslims, it's funny because this was directly relevant to the Protestant Reformation, but the Muslims that I find the most affinity towards are what are called Quran-only Muslims. And a lot of the, I think, really vicious stuff that you see in Islam, including the stuff about violence, about the treatment of women, is in what's called the Hadith. And they're allegedly sayings and stories of the Prophet that were compiled and collected about 200 to 300 years after the Prophet's death. And the Quran, by and large, I view as kind of a manual on just war. So it's not offensive violence is always wrong in the Quran. Violence against a fellow Muslim is always wrong. Violence against women and children is always wrong in the Quran. So you can only do defensive warfare. And if anyone wants peace, if someone comes to you and says they want peace, you're required to meet with them and then try to work things out for peace. All that's in the Quran. You have to accept people who are different from you. There should be no. You can't force anybody to any religious beliefs, according to the Quran. So, but in the Hadith, there's a lot of stuff about violence. It can be quite vicious. So I think Quran could use a reformation. Like I don't really like the Hadith very much. And so if Islam had a kind of Protestant, I view these people, the people who are Quran only people, as kind of Protestant reformers and trying to get Islam back to the Quran. So I think it would be a good thing if that happened.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna stop taking questions there. Sorry, people in the chat who, if you didn't get your questions answered, but going for an hour and a half now, we've gone through a whole bunch of stuff. But if people want to find more of I put the links to your books in the description. Is there anywhere else where you written on these topics and things if people are interested in?
Well, you can look my name up in the Huffington Post. I used to write a lot for the Huffington Post. And my piece on religion and violence is in there, and it's in 3 Quarks Daily, but I've written quite a bit on religion and violence. And most of my books are available for free. So just look my name up or send me an email, kclark84@yahoo.com, and I can send you links for free downloads.
Great. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for giving up your time and coming on. I really appreciate it, and appreciate that there are scholars who, do this to kind of share knowledge and information with people. And then obviously thank you everyone in the audience for watching. I hope people got things from this.
Thank you, Nathan.
Cool. I'll end the stream there.